Going to turn now to take a look at what's taking up ink in the international newspapers. Laurent Bersteker joins us on set for that. And indeed, Laurent, we're going to start with a greater look at the new restrictions that are expected to be announced here in France when it comes to COVID-19.
That's right, Eve. All eyes are now on the government ahead of tonight's big announcement. Most of major French newspapers are speculating as to what this announcement could contain. According to Le Monde, the epidemic is now completely out of control in France, with doctors warning they're already being severely overwhelmed in hospitals across the country. Now, Libération, another French daily, takes a look at what could be coming tonight and headlines on this picture of Prime Minister Jean Castex calling him Mr. Reconfinement. So the paper is fearing and arguing that a new lockdown could be on the cards and announced tonight. In an editorial, the newspaper argues that the current curfew measures have failed and that a lockdown of at least 4 weeks now appears necessary to curb infections. Meanwhile, taking a look at right-leaning daily newspaper Le Figaro, which asks whether the French economy, which is still reeling from the spring lockdown, will be able to survive these new restrictions. And finally, let's take a look at another French daily, Aujourd'hui en France, which sums up the general atmosphere quite nicely with this headline, "We will see tonight," and we're looking at other possible alternatives to a curfew, to a lockdown, for instance, longer curfew hours and more severe restrictions during the weekend.
Yeah, the figures in France really not encouraging a very rapid rate of infection here, but of course not the only country in France struggling. Give us an idea of what the other newspapers across the continent are saying.
Well, let's start with the UK, with Italy, where the situation is also getting worse, and where new sanitary measures were announced on Monday to reduce these infections. Measures which were perceived as a form of almost a semi-lockdown by some, and which led to some protests across the country. Looking at Italian newspaper Il Fatto Quotidiano, it says the right is suffering, the political right, at these measures, which will hurt the economy. And the newspaper argues the country is seeing a fracture now between those who support these measures, who see them as necessary, and those who oppose them. In an editorial, the paper takes a position there and calls those who protest the measures symptomatic idiots who are intent on making this a political issue, whereas it's actually, according to this newspaper, an issue of public health and of common sense. And the editorial reminds us that the real enemy here is the virus and not the government.
Protests across Italy for days now, and there have also been some in Barcelona in Spain, but you've also been checking in on papers in the United Kingdom. What's the British press saying about the situation over there?
Well, it's not looking great in the UK, and according to the Daily Telegraph, a second wave is already here, and it's likely to be more deadly than the first one. The newspaper is looking at projections based on a government study and saying that while the second wave would see a lower death peak than the first one, we can kind of see it here on this graph, on the right part of this graph. It's also likely to be much longer than the first, meaning more people would die overall. Now, this realization has led to calls for more drastic action by the government, with The Independent, the Eye among those, saying the current three-tiered lockdown doesn't work and calling on Prime Minister Boris Johnson to come up with an exit strategy.
Now, in the first wave, Germany fared better than its European neighbours, but in this second wave, it's also warning of harsh months to come.
Well, it's getting worse in Germany, and Deutsche Welle, an English-speaking German newspaper, is telling us that the government is now mulling tougher restrictions as a result of this new surge, with Angela Merkel set to meet state leaders later today and decide on a strategy. And it's looking like a tough meeting for Merkel, who will have to convince all 16 heads of state to agree to these restrictions, which could include the partial complete closures, for instance, of shops, bars, and restaurants.
Meanwhile, let's head across to the United States. COVID infections there continuing to spiral upwards and stretching the health system also to its limits.
Well, numbers in the U.S. are getting even scarier, and according to the New York Times, a recent study found that the country recorded a 46% increase in COVID patients over the past month. That's in hospitals across the country. According to this article, this surge happened mainly in parts of the U.S. which had been spared so far by the virus, relatively spared, And in many cases, these places have fewer resources to deal with the epidemic than the big cities where it kind of kicked off. And the article quotes a Texas doctor saying they wouldn't be able to cope with any kind of additional new disasters, for instance, a shooting or a natural disaster.
Well, let's end on some slightly better news. Laurent, Australia, the city of Melbourne, is lifting its very long lockdown.
That's right. One of the longest lockdowns was 112 days, or nearly 4 months, and the Herald Sun calls it a happy return to life as Melburnians are rushing back to shops and restaurants. It was a painful but successful strategy, according to the newspaper, with the city recording almost no new infections over the past month, or very, very few infections. However, residents in Melbourne should not expect a complete return to normal just yet, as the newspaper notes that several restrictions remain in place, including mandatory masks in several areas and limits on public gatherings.
Okay, so a cautious lifting of restrictions there. Laurent, thanks a lot for that look at the international national papers. And of course, you'll be with us again in 2 hours' time for another look. We're going to take a quick break now, but we'll be back with all the latest news updates in just a few minutes, so do stay with us.